Hello, Tom. It's a pleasure to
Greetings.
meet you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to interview you today. I think that this interview will be very helpful for everyone with misophonia. So, first, could you please introduce yourself and give us a brief description of all the years of research you have been doing about misophonia?
So my primary career is a behavioral parenting coach. I was an engineer, manufacturing engineer, and engineering manager for 30 years, and then I retired, looking for another career to do for the rest of my life. And I decided to do behavior science, behavior analysis in family dynamics. So as a parenting coach, I had a mother of a 12-year-old daughter who had this incurable hearing disorder called misophonia, and the girl had it was going to be this condition where she was not going to be able to have maybe stable relationships, and it was going to just disrupt her life, and there was no cure. It was just going to get worse with time. And so, this was my introduction to misophonia. And the girl had auditory, visual, and olfactory triggers, right? Odor triggers. And okay, that can't be a hearing neurological defect if you're getting it in through your eyes, your nose, and your ears also. So that must be a more generalized reflex condition. And so I thought, well, I have the time to do this. I was semi-retired. And I just said, I'm going to go figure out what misophonia is. It's a challenge. I like challenges. And so that was 11 and a half, almost 12 years now, actually, ago. And here I am, talking about misophonia still. We've learned some very important things, and it is very misunderstood. Misophonia is a very misunderstood condition. So anyway, that's what got me here today, and it's a real opportunity to be able to work with people now and help people.
Okay, thank you, Tom. That is such an interesting path career. And I think your research on misophonia has been incredibly insightful. And I have really enjoyed watching your informative videos on the subject. Um, Before we delve into the questions, I would like to provide a brief overview of misophonia, as you have already discussed it in one of your videos.
Okay.
Misophonia, literally meaning hatred of sound, is also referred to as selective sound sensitivity syndrome. Individuals with misophonia, like myself, experience strong negative reactions to specific sounds, and sometimes even to particular individuals making those sounds. However, it's important to differentiate misophonia from other conditions, as you said, such as hyperacusis, which is sensitivity to loud sounds, or phonophobia, which is fear of sound. Additionally, misophonia should not be confused with general sound intolerance or people who are bothered by typical sounds, such as a loud horn, a baby crying, etc. For a more detailed understanding of what misophonia is and what is not, as well as information on visual triggers or the brain's response to misophonia, I highly recommend watching Tom's video on YouTube, which will be linked in the description. Saying that, would you like to add something about misophonia, Tom?
Well, I guess the one thing I want to add about misophonia is that it's very misunderstood, and it is not included in the medical or the psychiatric list of all the disorders. So doctors and psychologists are not being trained on misophonia. It is also a very common condition, surprisingly common, that I believe is caused by normal neurology. So
Yeah, that's unbelievable, right? I mean, I totally agree with that. Well, now let's move on to the questions I have prepared for you, Tom. Are you ready
Thank
to
you.
respond?
I am ready to respond.
Perfect. The first question pertains to the relationship between misophonia and its underlying factors, whether psychological, physiological, or both. This arises from the observation that individuals with misophonia may exhibit intolerance towards specific sounds from certain individuals, while the same sound made by someone else might not be bothersome at all. Furthermore, it raises the question of whether misophonia could be linked to a trauma or if it's simply a matter of not having previously noticed the repetitive nature of the sound. What do you think?
Okay, well, I think let me start by describing what misophonia is. So let me pop up a little page here. And if you go out online and you look for misophonia, what is misophonia? It's kind of this unknown hearing disorder, but we know it's hearing and sight and other things, where people have these really intense negative emotions. And some people, everybody doesn't have all these emotions, and everybody's not the same severity, but it's this unknown condition. It's really an emotional regulation disorder. What our research indicates is that you hear the trigger stimulus, and 200 milliseconds later, there is a flinch in your body, and it or a sensation. Most of them is muscle flinches, and then maybe, I don't know, another 50 or 100 milliseconds later, you get these very intense negative emotions, and these emotions are so strong that this is what you experience. You experience the negative emotions, the overall distress, the horrible, it feels horrible, the overall bodily response. You want to make it stop, run out of the room, attack. Not, most people don't attack, but this is the experience of misophonia, but this is what drives it. Now, Mario Lee, do you experience this initial physical reflex?
Yeah, every time.
Every time. And can I ask where it is in your body?
It starts, I think that in my hands or maybe my neck.
Okay. And it can be different for every trigger. It can be different. So for chewing sounds, maybe your hands clench, and for sniffing sounds, maybe your neck clenches and tightens. So, but because this is not noticed, the normal view of misophonia is this, right? That all of that hand and neck and things are thought to be over here as the stress response. So anyway, misophonia is a very misunderstood condition because of that.
Okay.
So if we go back and say, what is misophonia? It is a learned physical reflex condition. It's a result of Pavlovian conditioning.
Okay.
So with Pavlovian conditioning, anytime the brain stem, the autonomic nervous system, is noticing a sound, and for about 2 seconds it watches, oh, there's that muscle tighten. Sound, there is the same muscle. Sound, there is the same muscle. It goes, oh my goodness, I could do that for you. And then it's sound, and then boom, 200 milliseconds, it hits you. And then your natural response is, ah, which gives the feedback to the brain that it made a correct prediction and it should keep doing it. So looking at it as a Pavlovian conditioned reflex, we learn certain things. Through extensive Pavlovian conditioning research, we know that a conditioned reflex is controlled by a complex stimulus. It's not just the sound. It's the sound, the setting, social expectation, who is there, all of the stimuli contribute to that complex stimulus. So it is expected that if your mother is a key stimulus in your misophonia reflex learning by that lizard brain, that you would either be much more intense of a response maybe to your mother, or it may be only to your mother and not to others. So sometimes it's the sound precision that you, and I don't know if your mother triggers you or not, but it's the sound precision of one person versus another, and sometimes it's a context. So early on, I was working with a woman doing some relaxation training, and she was relaxing and she was relaxing, and she says, "Oh, just a second, I think there are children playing behind my house." And I said, "Oh, is that triggering you?" She goes, "Oh yeah." And so she goes away. She comes back a minute later and says, "Oh, they're doing some repair work. It's not a problem. Let's continue." So when she thought it was children playing, it was a trigger. When she found out it was adults working, it was not a trigger. So this is not a psychological issue here between you and another person. It is much more an issue of the normal characteristics of Pavlovian conditioning. Now, there are cases where certain sounds, that little brainstem of yours, I like to jokingly call it your lizard brain. It doesn't think, it just acts on the stimuli. But it also has certain precision. So, for example, the first young man I ever helped, we were just exploring misophonia. We had him, he was only triggered by his mother's crunchy chewing. And so we had him face the wall. I got 2 free toes the size of my thumbnail. I put one in my mouth, crunch, crunch, crunch. No, that's nothing. Mom does it. That's it. So without seeing us, the subtle sound difference between mother chewing and me chewing was enough to make a difference as to whether he was triggered or not. So the back to your question, I'm not sure if I answered all your questions. Yes, there are a lot of psychological factors that play into misophonia. There are psychological, neurological factors that cause one person to be more likely to develop misophonia than another. For example, a person who is generally sensitive to stimuli, maybe the loud sounds and the sticky surfaces or closed tags, or a person is just generally kind of more noticing of these stimuli, makes it more likely for them to develop misophonia. There's a gene that's been identified with misophonia, but misophonia is not truly a genetic disorder, because if you have the misophonia, the average, my guess, the prevalence of misophonia is about 10% of the world. So that's a lot of people that have misophonia. And if you have so pick a person at random, the chances of them developing misophonia during their life is 10%. Take a person that has the misophonia gene, and the chance of them developing misophonia in their lifetime is 11.8%. So not a big factor, right? I mean, it makes it more likely. And in my work, I found that people who have anxiety, people who are very emotionally sensitive to feelings and emotions, are more likely to develop misophonia. But fundamentally, misophonia is simply a learned reflex disorder through Pavlovian conditioning. Did I answer it seemed like there was a little complexity to the question. Did I get all the factors?
Yeah, I think that is very clear. In addition, I would like to say I also don't like the crunchy sounds of my mom, but when she does the sound intentionally, I really don't care. So the second question is closely connected to the first one. Some individuals with misophonia report that intentionally generated sounds by others do not elicit any emotional response, as opposed to unintentional sound. What are your
Okay.
thoughts on this particular aspect?
So I'm going to ask that you try to put on a different paradigm thinking about misophonia, okay? Misophonia is the misophonia stimulus triggers a physical reflex, and the physical reflex triggers the emotions. So because the situation is different with the person intentionally making the sound, it didn't trigger your initial physical reflex. Therefore, you don't have any emotions. So I have seen this in my clinical work. One of the most important things in my clinical assessments is to help a person determine their initial physical reflex. Because this chain of events of misophonia happens so quickly, and you're from the time that you hear the start of the trigger till you're into your misophonia experience is so short that you really, most people cannot identify or even realize that they have the initial physical reflex. So in determining that, I work with them to try to make microscopic triggers so small that it'll barely trigger the reflex and then not trigger the emotional response, or at least just a mild irritation at most. And in that situation, most of the people can identify their initial physical reflex. But some people, it doesn't work because I'm intentionally doing it, it doesn't trigger them. So I have seen this. I think it's usually, Marley, more common that doing it on purpose still triggers the person. But yes, sometimes when they do it on purpose, it doesn't trigger them.
Okay. I think you answered the question very well. It's clear to me. So now I will provide you with the context so you can respond to the third question. Well, during my cognitive behavioral therapy sessions, my therapist asked whether I tend to have inflexible thoughts or beliefs, and I confirmed that I do. Following that, I was prompted to identify the specific thoughts that arise when I hear trigger sounds. I mentioned thoughts such as that is disgusting, why does he do that, that is not correct, that is disrespectful, and so on. My therapist highlighted that questioning why someone engages in such behavior reflects my inclination towards rigid thinking, as if I expect others to conform to my standards. And this suggests that I struggle with cognitive flexibility, like seeking validation for my perception of correct behaviors, such as chewing gum, breathing, closing doors. And therefore, what is your opinion regarding the relationship between inflexible thought patterns and beliefs associated with misophonia? Do you believe it is entirely true that mental rigidity can play a significant role in the emotional and behavioral reactions triggered by specific sounds?
I believe that that emotional rigidity or psychological rigidity can play a significant role in the development of misophonia. Because if you hear a sound, you don't have misophonia. This is, the day before you got misophonia. You hear a sound and you think, that's not right. She's breaking the rules. She shouldn't do that. Why would she do that why would mother chew with her mouth open after she just scolded me for chewing with my mouth open? Or whatever, some form of a negative thought. So it's sound and a negative thought, sound and a negative thought. Now, that negative thought is going to have a physical component to it. And that physical component then becomes your initial physical reflex. So it's sound, that's not fair. Sound, that's not fair. Sound, that's not fair. And so what the brainstem sees is the sound and the hands, the sound and the hands. And then it goes, oh my goodness, Marley, I could do that for you. And then it's sound, boom, and you're like, ah. And so it definitely plays a part, and it may also play a part in the increasing of the severity. So yes, psychological flexibility is important. And in fact, there is a treatment that, and I don't remember, I know the acronym for it is EASE, EASE, but it works, it goes after the psychological flexibility aspect, because if you heard the sound and then your hands did this and your brain kind of goes, with the emotions, but you go, nah, it's okay. Sound, oh, it's okay. Then it would allow that reflex to die out. So yes, psychological flexibility, rigid thinking does play, perfectionism does play a part in the development and maintenance of misophonia.
Okay. Well, now that we talked about rigidity, I wanted to talk about progressive muscle relaxation. I know that you talked about this before. That will be also linked in the description of this video. You talk about this as a training to reduce misophonia's severity.
Yes.
What other specific techniques or strategies do you recommend for managing misophonia triggers and reducing distress? In addition, are there any alternative therapies or complementary approaches such as acupuncture or hypnotherapy that you would recommend for managing misophonia's symptoms?
Good question. So let's see if I can get all the components of that. So with the treatment of misophonia, you either need to try to reduce the initial physical reflex, or there's some techniques that work directly on the emotional reflex. So with this initial reflex, you can't just cut it out and make it stop, but by relaxing before and through a trigger, you actually can reduce this reflex with time. And so that's the reason, one of the reasons for doing progressive muscle relaxation training, is that if you have, let's say, a toe curl reflex, then developing the ability to relax your toes will allow this to happen when you're in the normal course of events of hearing triggers. So that would be the goal of working on the initial physical reflex. Now, there is another program called sequent repatterning hypnotherapy. And sequent repatterning hypnotherapy works, it recognizes that you don't simply hear a trigger, you experience a trigger. And after that event, then it works to reduce these very strong emotions. And it is, you can go to search for sequent repatterning hypnotherapy, and you will find information about it. There's a website, and there's a number of trained therapists, maybe getting close to maybe 10 trained therapists in the world that do this technique. Other things that help. First off, it's very important to understand that when you experience triggers, just the normal world of being triggered, that your misophonia strengthens with normal experience. So unlike some form of response where you habituate to the stimulus and you stop responding to it, with misophonia, the more you're triggered, the stronger your misophonia, but worse the misophonia becomes. So, and the reason for that is that you hear the trigger, and your brain stem, your lizard brain, hits the muscle, and then it looks and says, "Did I do the right thing?" And if you kind of go and tighten it a little bit, it goes, "Oh, good, I predicted correctly, I'll keep doing it." But if it's, let's say, a stronger, more irritating situation, then it's trigger, boom, and the lizard brain goes, "Oh, I predicted correctly, but I didn't do it hard enough." So then it's trigger, boom, and it just gets harder and harder and harder. So enduring prolonged misophonia distress only makes your misophonia worse. So good management is important. If you live in a place where you're going to be getting sounds of your neighbor playing their music coming into your home all evening long, and that's a trigger for you, and you're just getting more and more worked up, you're only torturing yourself and making your misophonia worse. So adding sound to your room, if you had a neighbor, for example, who played their music, you can play your music with lots of bass, because your bass would be coming through, and so you wouldn't be triggered by the neighbor. So avoiding triggers is actually good. Now, trying to avoid all triggers will ruin your life. It'll make your misophonia worse. Doesn't work. Puts you like where you're really scared, is there going to be another trigger? But good management is an important technique for misophonia. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I'll show you a little drawing here that we have. And with this drawing, this is from a journal article that we're getting published right now. And so this is the Dozier model. And in 2018, I trained Nate Mitchell on this model, and he's a psychologist. And so he put a more cognitive behavioral complete model. And one of the important factors is this anticipatory anxiety and avoidance that you get in misophonia. Mario Lee, you probably had situations where you were getting ready to go into a room and you thought, "Oh, there's a trigger in there. There's gonna, and all of a sudden you're tense. And if you're tense, you respond stronger here, and it just makes it worse." So one of the reasons for doing progressive muscle relaxation is to be able to go, relax. When you feel tense, that word, "I feel tense," comes from my muscles are tense. And if you relax your muscles, then you don't feel so tense. So trying to reduce this anticipatory anxiety is good. Avoidance of, now I'm not saying not good management, but just try to total avoidance makes you more anxious and on edge for it.